All right. So I think we are all ready to go now. And I'm not going to really talk very much about contemporary politics this week. We spoke last week about the Biden uh, American Rescue Act, the most recent round of stimulus in light of the coronavirus contraction in the economy and its more systematic ambitions. And you may note that it's being compared with the Great Society legislation or even with the New Deal. The ambition is there. I'm not sure that the scope is there, but there's no doubt that this is going to be a dramatic change of course, not just from the last 4 years, but really from the last 25, maybe even 50 years, in really reorienting state policy. We've tried for a long time to allow the capitalist market economy to grow, and in so doing, to lift all boats. The result of the experiment with unregulated capitalism, or much less regulated capitalism, I think would probably be the better way to put it, has been a vast increase in wealth. And I think it's extremely important to notice that over the last 50 years, but a very unequal distribution of that wealth. And so this seems to me to be the opening salvos in what would have to be a concerted battle to redistribute the wealth that the less regulated economy has generated over the last 50 years to bolster the middle class, which has contracted considerably, and to create a sense of minimum decency as a basic social right for all citizens, as opposed to the precariousness that so many people experience these days. All of that to say, I think this is a significant piece of legislation, but we talked a little bit about it last week, and I don't want to go into all the details this week. I want to finish out the lecture series that we're in the middle of right now. So I will come back to this legislation at a later lecture. What I want to speak about with you today, the ongoing series we're doing on technology and what it's doing to us. And I have been pivoting in the last week in the direction of political economy. And I want to talk about the political economy underlying the digital assault on attention and privacy today. And in order to do that, I'm going to introduce the new idea of surveillance capitalism as perhaps a new business model that modifies the business model that Tim Wu refers to as attention merchants or attention harvesting. Now, having said that, I do want to review in order to make this transition. And I'll just remind you briefly that in thinking about the more social implications, what the new technology is doing to the knowledge system of 21st century societies, what it's doing to political communication, I looked at two authors, Nicholas Carr, who is here on the right, the author of The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brain. He's an independent journalist who has written several very well-regarded books on topics to do with technology, and is also widely published, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, among other things. And then Tim Wu, who's a professor at Columbia University, where he teaches law, but is a quite wide-ranging scholar. And we focused on his book, The Attention Merchants, the epic scramble to get inside our heads, and this idea that around 200 years ago, some enterprising journalists and publishers invented this new business model in which they actually sold the product of their labor for less than it costs them to manufacture it. That is to say, a newspaper for a penny when it might have cost them a nickel to make it. And the way in which you could make a profit by selling your product for less than it cost you to make it is if you generated advertising revenue. And it took a while for this business model to take hold, for the idea that you could, in fact, entice the readers of your newspaper to shop or patronize the businesses that advertised in your pages. The original entrepreneurs in the penny press had to give out their advertising for free, often did actually unsolicited advertising, put an advertisement for a business that didn't ask them to put the advertisement in order to demonstrate to the business, this is what happens if you advertise in our pages. Look at the boost you just got in business. Don't you want that on a regular basis? And so the core claim in Wu's work is that what attention merchants are really selling is not their product to consumers, but their consumers' attention to advertisers, and that attention is actually an extremely valuable commodity. And I should have pictures on the pages here of Mark Zuckerberg or the founders of Google, right? Companies that in a sense sell nothing, at least their core products, the Google search engine, Gmail, Facebook, are available for free, YouTube, etc. And yet they are among the richest individuals in the world. Their companies are among the most highly valued corporations in the world. They represent the far end of the trajectory of the development of the attention merchant business model. And Wu, in tracing the history from the early 19th century to the early 21st century, notes that these products have gotten more and more sophisticated, that advertising has become more and more sophisticated, that the ability of the behavioral sciences to tell advertisers what works to capture or direct people's attention and to actually enlist their interest in your product. All of that has grown in sophistication. At the same time that the transformation in the media has given attention merchants access to more and more of our time and more spaces in our lives. And he tells the interesting story of the way in which in the early days, radio allowed sponsors, but not advertising. And that even when it came to sponsorship, people were reluctant, I should say, merchants were reluctant to sponsor shows during dinner time because it felt like a violation of the sense of privacy and propriety. You don't do something that's commercial when people are eating dinner, right? And it's only actually with Amos and Andy, the show that some of you may be familiar with and in certain ways has been very rightly criticized for its racist dimensions. But that show was the first show to get sponsorship while being broadcast during dinner time, right? And so the sense that there's a kind of barrier to what is commercially appropriate, the time that it can occur, the place that it can occur, has fallen away, right? And we now carry these devices to bed with us. We put them under our pillow. We bring them into the bathroom, et cetera, and so on. And of course, they constantly beam commercial content into the most intimate quarters of our lives. And when I say constantly, I mean that, right? That it is available there every moment of every day of your life. And so this is what Tim Wu is focused on. And let me just get us to the next slide. And again, I don't want to review all of this, just refreshing your memory that what Nicholas Carr called our attention to, among other things, is the transition in the early modern period into silent reading and private writing, and how deep the cultural impact of that was, that this gave rise to the novel and the essay, and perhaps even the scientific revolution and humanism and the Enlightenment, right? I mean, the profound effects from changing the medium of broadcasting and communication into the culture as a whole. And that as we are shifting, perhaps in the most important shift in our media since the Gutenberg Revolution, into digital media that are connected via wireless wavelengths that allow for social media, and so publication by anyone. We are beginning to discern similarly systematic cultural effects, and that's whether we look at the nature of writing, where we're writing for instant feedback, writing to be liked, quote unquote, in the Facebook terminology, right? And that reading is also being changed into also a social act, but an act performed with constantly fractured attention, in which we jump from article to article, screen to screen, app to app, following links. And it's just a very different kind of attitude, concentration, attention, habit of the mind that is cultivated when we read on these devices as opposed to reading on the page. And the suggestion I want us to take away from this is if we are entering a postmodern epoch, how much of that can we attribute to the exhaustion of modernity, right? The ambitions of enlightenment and humanism certainly have run into difficulties. But is it that they are no longer defensible as projects? Or is it instead that the media, communication, and knowledge environment that the book, the printed word, the age of the literary public gave rise to, has given way to a new media, communication, knowledge environment that encourages different attitudes, and those attitudes, those orientations to self and other and knowledge, are being described as the onset of a postmodern era, as we change the tone of our relationship to knowledge, as we become more ironic, as we change our relationship to our identities as well. And so, right, that's the big thesis of Nicholas Carr's work. The title of the book, The Shallows, right, in many ways expresses this idea that the media environment we're in right now encourages a more shallow attitude to ethics, a more shallow attitude to self, a more shallow attitude to our relations with each other, our kinds of communication. Now,
excuse me, David,
yes,
may I interrupt for a moment?
It's not interrupting, but yes,
okay.
Please pull us into dialogue. Who is this?
Wilma Rader.
Oh, there you are, Wilma. Hi.
Hi. What you said just now triggered, because at the same time all of that has been happening, there's been a tremendous movement away from the religious to the secular. Sundays were always sacred. One did nothing. The shops were closed. In New England, absolutely nothing happened. In Scotland, nothing happened on a Sunday. That was a day set aside. That was Sabbath. It was set aside. And slowly over time, there has been the incursion of commercialism on those days. All of a sudden, it's not just you could buy booze, but you could go shopping. And the sacred has been lost. But at the same time, there is the pushback. There is a movement towards mindfulness and trying to carve out from this commercialism another sacred space. So I think that might be happening on many levels. There is pushback.
Yeah, and so I'll just briefly tell my version of the story, which is and so when I was in graduate school in England, a friend of mine was dating the daughter of the master of one of the big colleges at Cambridge University. And I didn't have plans for Christmas. They invited me to spend Christmas with them. And I didn't recognize what a generous invitation it was. They said, we'll leave on the 23rd, and once we're there, we'll figure out how to get back. Well, what I didn't know is that England closed the 25th, the 24th, the 25th, the 26th. It started to open back up on the 27th, but because everybody had been frozen in place, it was really hard to get a coach or a bus on the 27th, right? And so really they were basically inviting me for a week to be with them because society closed down so much for religious observation, right? And obviously the United States has been, more or less from its inception, a multi-denominational state, a state without an established religion. And so we have in the First Amendment a principle that's sometimes called the principle of the separation of church and state. And so that has made differences. But you're absolutely right that when we look at behavior, it appears that we're living in a much less religious society today than we were, say, 60 years ago. And it's a separate story. And whether or not mindfulness is a reaction to digital distraction or a hunger for the sacred and the transcendent, it's probably some of each, right? But I want to be careful in what I say. At some point, I think I have given lectures to this community about some of the literature on what's now called a post-secular society, right? So this idea that we were on our way to being a secular society, and guess what? We didn't get there. And we didn't get there because so many people continue to maintain their belief in God or the transcendent, or religion remains an important social factor in their life. So however you want to describe it, we did not get all the way to a secular society, so there's this idea of a post-secular society. All that to say that this is a complex, interesting, important topic. There's not one that I'm ready to talk about today, but what your point really brings out is we've got to be careful in thinking about there's a single explanation for everything I'm talking about, right? And I'm obviously emphasizing technology, but technology is one of many variables that are at work in our society. What about the economy? What about religion? What about immigration? What about political polarization, right? There are a whole bunch of other factors as well. Some of them may be complementing or magnifying what technology is doing. Some of them may be offsetting what technology is doing. And so thank you for calling me out of tunnel vision and reminding me I've got to say, and I should say, we're looking at this from one angle. And from the angle of technology, this is the way it looks. But there are definitely other angles we can and should be looking at things from as well. Thank you for the good comment. Anybody else while we're out of the slides? Okay, then I'm going to take us back into the slides. And by the way, I really mean it when I say it's not an interruption. You know, one of the things I miss being in Zoom is being able to look out at the room and say, wait a sec, there's somebody who looks like they've got a puzzled face. Maybe I should pause for a second and make sure there's not a comment lurking behind that puzzled look. So one of the ways that I propose that we synthesize Tim Wu, and it's not only Tim Wu, this is really a bunch of work on the evolution of the public of modern society, is to think about two dimensions of contrast in attention. And this is not perfect, but I think it works as a kind of heuristic. Do you control your own attention, or does your attention go where it wants to go? And in a sense, you're along for the ride. And to be clear, that experience, right? You know, a bird flies into your window, and your head is moving before you even think about what it is. There was just a loud noise in the periphery of your vision, and you're all of a sudden looking at the source of that noise, right? That is, in a sense, probably the way in which the human brain is wired to work. We're actually designed to survive in circumstances that are filled with threats. And our attention is designed, therefore, to operate automatically. When it does that, when we're in an environment where we're not filled with threats or where it's not necessarily adaptive, we tend to experience that as being distracted. But I think it's important to remember that that's kind of the baseline of human attention, is to dart all over the place, to be a fox and not a hedgehog, to use the Aesop's fable metaphor, right? To look a whole bunch of places and not just stay concentrated in one. But one of the things reading and conversation and maybe paying attention to complex artistic works, whether that's a painting or a sculpture or a play, do to us is help us to reprogram our attention, to be able to really concentrate and shut down those distractions, right? And so one of the things that we're finding is that the way in which human attention works is mainly by eliminating a whole bunch of input, not by really deeply diving into one kind of input. That's what attention is. And to get there, we have to be able to direct our attention the way we would if we were reading a big novel. If we're reading War and Peace, right, you've got to try to tune out the world in order to pay self-directed attention. So that's, do you control your attention, or does your attention go where it wants to go? The other question is, how long do you pay attention for, right? And is your capacity to pay attention something that you can sustain over a long period of time? Or is it something that comes and goes in short bursts, right? And so my diagram here, and again, I think the point that I've got to be careful about simplifying things is absolutely well taken with regard to this diagram as well, but it's about the kind of attention that different media environments encourage us to develop. And of course, the media environment is not the only thing that is influencing our attention. And so school and studies and friends and sports and our significant others, etc., religious worship, all also influence how we pay attention. But the general claim here is that the kind of media and the kind of public sphere we had, and I'm sorry, I should have put periods on this, but let's call this the mid 18th to mid 19th century, right? That this was a period that encouraged self-directed and sustained attention, because we read newspapers and novels, we played chamber music, we went to symphonies and plays, right? There wasn't TV, there wasn't radio, there weren't movies. What were we going to do with our leisure time, right? And that the fact that these were the media that were in existence affect us in a whole bunch of ways. And to be clear, my central claim here is that the first big wave of modern democratic revolutions, the wave that produced the American Constitution, that led to reform of the British Constitution, the French Revolution, etc. And much of the philosophy about politics that influenced the next couple of centuries, that was this period. And that as our media evolved into cinema and radio and then television and now digital technology, our attention has been reconfigured. The demands that the media place on our attention, the influence that it has on us has changed. And that we may be seeing changes in our relationship to knowledge, in our culture, and in our politics as a result. Now, I know there's too much on this screen, and so I want to introduce a new diagram that contrasts the beginning and the end of this story, right? So this is the 18th and 19th century. This is the 21st century, and right, it gives us not only the exemplary media contrasting, right, social media with newspapers and novels. It gives us the character of the public that that kind of media seems to address. What is it that the newspaper and the novel expect of their readers? And my suggestion, and here I'm following some recent work by Jürgen Habermas, is that it addresses what I'm calling a rational critical public, a public that evaluates argument on the basis of evidence and logic, but doesn't take for granted the authority of the writer, but instead tries to determine on their own the merits of the claim being made. And that as opposed to that, public, in the age of digital media, this media is oriented to people who are distracted, who are paying attention to a whole bunch of things at the same time. And it tries to give us a salacious flash to get us to pay 10 seconds of our attention to it, right? And so it's a different set of values or orientation that is informing those who produce media content. Where do we receive the actual content of the media? And here I've got a rather long construction: deliberately constituted cultural public spheres. And I want to be clear. Think about the salon, right? This French idea of a gathering of people to engage in art criticism or critical discussion. Originally in Germany, there were table societies. In England, pubs were there for the same reason. And so that's all part of the idea that you create a space in which people are going to come together to talk about these works, right? And similarly, the family was seen as a space where people engaged with these works in order to cultivate themselves. It's worthwhile noting that in European architecture, studies and family rooms came into being around this period. Whereas in the age of digital media, the space of reception is everywhere and anywhere. You remember back to the title of, the cover of Sherry Turkle's Alone Together. You've got people walking down the street with their nose in their device, right? So it could be walking down the street, could be driving, could be in the bathroom, in the bedroom, on the back porch. There's no, in a sense, specific space. It's everywhere. When I say temporality, I'm referring at this point to when we receive this information and how we relate ourselves to others in time. right? And so to be concrete, there's a sense that the newspaper, for instance, is read at the same time, more or less, right? That is to say, with a morning paper in the morning, with an evening paper in the evening. And so there's some sense that you're connected to a larger public when you read the newspaper. It helps you to constitute what one scholar calls an imagined community, a community of people all reading the newspaper or watching the Super Bowl at the same time. But nevertheless, it's still an individualized act. Reading the newspaper, right? You're going to be irritated, probably, if somebody tries to read it over your shoulder, right? If you got two people in the house, both of whom want to read the newspaper, either you set a schedule, so who gets it when, or maybe you get two copies of the newspaper if you can afford it, right? It's an individualized act, right? Whereas by the time we get to the age of social media, uh, we are constantly connected, right? It's not one period of the day, it's all the time. And although there is a kind of simultaneity, right, the sense that I'm doing this at the same time as somebody else, that is the simultaneity of the social page, as Nicholas Carr calls it, right? That is the sense that I'm going to post something on Facebook or YouTube or Instagram, and then I'm going to wait for the comments and the likes or the related posts to come in, right? And so it's a social activity. Writing for the newspaper, you don't expect to see a letter to the editor, but every now and then and a couple days later, right? It's not this sense of a social activity. Uh, Commercial penetration, and here again, I want to be as clear and careful as possible. To what degree is the content of the work being carried by the medium in question tailored in order to be sold or to circulate as a commodity? And the claim that Wu and Habermas and others make is that it was only to a very limited degree in this early modern period, going back to the 18th and 19th century, that although the newspaper sold as a commodity, the individual article was not tailored to be easy to read, dumbed down, appealing to the lowest common denominator. But when we get to our current period, the cultural products that are carried by our media have been fully commodified. They're just made to appeal to the largest possible audience, but at the same time, highly differentiated, right? ESPN appeals to the sports head, and CNN to the news head, right? And within the news environment, Fox News and MSNBC to opposite ends of the ideological spectrum. Finally, the mode of circulation, I'm referring this to medium cast as opposed to broad or narrow cast. I made up that term just to point out that the public was conceived as being relatively narrow, but not fragmented. Whereas in the current period, we have a lot of narrow casting. You appeal only to the people who like sports, only to the arch conservatives, only to the loony left, right? And depending upon which market segment you're going for, you tailor your content to be appealing only to people in that segment. But then there's a broadcast element to it as well. ABC, NBC, CBS are still out there and still trying to reach as broad an audience as possible. Now, I hope these contrasts are making sense, and this is really getting us into the details of media criticism, if you will, the way in which we need to think about different media systems as having systematic, cultural, cognitive, political effects. And if our Constitution was written for this kind of media sphere, for the public that this kind of media sphere encourages, for the knowledge system that this kind of media sphere develops. And if we're living in a very different media sphere, then we should not anticipate that our constitution, our politics will work in the 21st century in the same way that they worked in the 18th or the 19th century. In a sense, you should say, no, duh, David, obviously that's the case. But this helps us to drill down on some of those sources of difference in different periods. All right, so having done all of that, and I know it was a long review, I hope it's making sense, but I now want to turn to still different work, and this will be the last work in thinking about the political economy of digital capitalism. And the work is by an author whose name is Shoshana Zuboff. She was a longtime professor at the Harvard Business School. She's now retired and emeritus professor, and she's been working for a very long time on this book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And I know, I think I held it up for you before to point out to you that this is a 650-page book. It's her magnum opus. She's been working on technology and the economy for a long time. This is a book from almost 20 years ago, In the Age of the Smart Machine, the Future of Work and Power. And she brings a decidedly humanistic, political, social perspective. She's not narrowly interested in how this kind of business model makes profit or what it's like to work for it. She's interested in the bigger social effects. And as you can see from the subtitle of The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, the fight for a human future at the new frontier of power, this is a decidedly political work. And as we will get into, she is arguing that a new business model, that this is not just attention merchants coming out of the 19th century into the 21st century with new technology, that there's a new way of making profit from providing digital media content, and that it is particularly hostile to human freedom and autonomy. And so, right, the big question of this section of the lecture series is, if we are not entirely comfortable with what this technology is doing to us, why is it that we're not regulating, that we're not taking better control, that we're not a little bit more deliberate about how we use this technology, how we adopt it? And my simple claim is that the economy, the magnitude of profits to be made from this business model is driving it. And Zuboff will help us to get into the details. So let me start today by introducing some of Zuboff's central concepts, the vocabulary that she uses in describing surveillance capitalism. And so, to begin with, the very idea of surveillance capitalism is that profit in the 21st century, in a growing and increasingly formative sector of our economy, that is to say, it accounts for more and more of the wealth creation in 21st century economics, and it also influences almost every other sector of the economy. So it's beginning to structure the economy as a whole. The way in which profit is accumulated in this sector of the economy is primarily from extracting information about human behavior. That is to say, the behavior of you and me and anybody else using this technology. And it's not just that the information itself is valuable, right? And clearly it is, but that what the information promises for those who hold it or buy it and know how to use it is the capacity to control uh, future human behavior. And in particular, we can talk about this at first in a non-sinister market environment, the capacity to tailor products precisely to the needs, interests, and desires of consumers, right? And arguably, that's what the market economy is all about. That's part of what makes it something that thinkers as diverse as Adam Smith and George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel praised, right? Its capacity to encourage diverse needs and interests and desires and then to satisfy them, right? So not necessarily a bad or a sinister thing, but when it becomes too fine-grained, when the amount of information to be collected is so minute, when we open ourselves to constant surveillance, when we, in a sense, implicitly sign up for a bargain whereby we get lots of free information and technology all the time in exchange for letting those who provide the technology constantly watch, monitor, collect information about us, the capacity to control and manipulate us grows, right? And so that is what Zuboff is concerned about, and we can talk about it in its more sinister forms, the way in which, for instance, facial recognition technology is making mass suppression in China of the Uyghurs or in Hong Kong or in other places of the world possible. But in a sense, Zuboff wants to suggest that we are all subject now to a tremendous surveillance regime, but that it's a surveillance regime that is not controlled by our governments, as it is in the case of China and other repressive regimes, at least not in the first instance. As opposed to that, it is controlled by market actors, by commercial enterprises, by Google and Facebook and Microsoft Word, and I should just say Microsoft, sorry, and that while the Orwellian scenario of the government being Big Brother is something that should frighten us, so should the scenario of large corporations acquiring Big Brother-like power, or what Zuboff calls Big Other power. And so to now begin to get into the more detailed conceptualization of surveillance capitalism, I'm going to start with this concept of the extraction imperative. And here her basic idea is that this model of profit making requires that when firms compete with each other, they extract more and more data and information, more and more private information from their viewers and users. And in order to get into the details here, I want to present a couple of diagrams to you. So I'm going to skip ahead to a diagram that Zuboff develops to talk about the original and what she sees as benign business model that Google operated under. And this business model was one where users used Google and as they did, Google looked at their behavior. When you were searching for sushi in Oakland, were you looking for a restaurant? Were you looking for takeout? Were you trying to find Japantown, right? You know, what exactly were you doing? And so they analyzed the behavior of their users. And in so doing, they probably captured a whole lot of other information, but they weren't using it, right? And so that's the idea of data exhaust, that there was just a whole bunch of other information that they didn't pay a lot of attention to. When they figured out what the person who searched for sushi in Oakland was actually looking for, they used that behavioral data in their analytic model in order to improve their service that users then used again. And then as the service improved, more information could then be gathered. And so this is a kind of feedback cycle, which she refers to as a behavioral value reinvestment cycle. And the fact that Google had so many users, that its algorithm was so sophisticated in generating search results so quickly, and that its use of high-powered computing and increasingly artificial intelligence allowed it to analyze both the behavior of its users and the contents of the World Wide Web so quickly, allowed Google to constantly improve its service and constantly get new users. But and here's the critical but, and we'll get into what drove them to do this later. But at some point, Google discovered, if you go back, and I'm sorry, I know there's a lot going on in this diagram. This is taken directly from Zuboff's book. If you go back to this original diagram, right? There's the rendered behavior, right? That's what Google is seeing its users do, and there's the data exhaust. Everything you're about to see in this diagram is what Google discovered it could do with the data that was not directly relevant to improving their search services, right? And so this is the rendered behavior, right? Built on top of that original diagram now is this second diagram. And as opposed to data exhaust, right? The data now is a surplus, right? And for those of you who know a little bit of Marx, you will recognize this idea of surplus value. There was a surplus value in the data harvesting model, right? And this surplus is now fed into new analytics to create what are called prediction products. The person who searches for sushi in Oakland, what else do they search for? What kinds of things is that person likely to buy? Obviously, sushi in Oakland, but are there other things, kinds of clothes or shoes or other meals? Do the person who likes sushi in Oakland also like Ethiopian food in Berkeley? If we can analyze their other searches and the other information that comes out of that search, maybe we can begin to predict more precisely what it is that this kind of person, the kind of person who does a search for sushi in Oakland, is likely to want in the future. And so we're going to make a prediction, and then we're going to sell that prediction as a product. And as we get better and better at doing that, a whole market is going to develop in people buying products that predict future behavior. The person who searches on Saturday for sushi in Oakland is likely to search on Sunday for Ethiopian in Berkeley. And so why not Saturday night when they go to open their newspaper or their email, advertise for Ethiopian in Berkeley? We'll get ahead of them, right? And the result of making these prediction products and selling them is surveillance revenues. And all of a sudden, the profits go way up for Google, right? And some of those profits can be redirected into making this process more and more sophisticated, right? And so this is when what Zuboff calls the behavioral surplus is discovered and begins to be used by Google, and other companies quickly follow suit in deciding, wait, if Google can do this, so can we. And so when you like something on Facebook, what are you saying about yourself? When your eyes stay on a posting on Facebook for more than 10 seconds, what are you revealing about yourself? When a window appears on Facebook and you click on it in order to open it to see more about that particular posting, cute dog behavior, what are we learning about you, and how can we use that to predict your behavior, to be able to sell it, to be able to make profits, right? And so I hope you see the way this is different from the attention merchants model. And let me get out of the screen share because we need to leave a few minutes for discussion. The attention merchants model was, we're going to capture everybody's attention. And then if there's a good enough likelihood that everybody who's reading the newspaper, the one of 2 or 3 newspapers for the whole area, is going to like Ethiopian food, then we'll advertise Ethiopian food. If not, we won't. The new model says we can predict exactly who is susceptible to being influenced to like Ethiopian food now. And so we'll let you advertise only to them. You don't have to advertise to 1,000 people to find one person who likes Ethiopian food. What if you could advertise just to 2 people and one of them is going to come to your restaurant, right? It makes your advertising much more targeted, much more directed. And I won't get into all of the stuff you can do, but you can actually go neighborhood by neighborhood. The people who live in the Piedmont neighborhood in Oakland are much more likely to like Ethiopian food than the people who live in this other neighborhood in Oakland. We can let you advertise only to them. The people who drive European cars are much more likely. And by the way, this person searched for a mechanic for their BMW last week, so we're pretty sure that they drive a European car, right? I hope you can see the way in which this business model starts taking off around a decade ago and has become one of the most important new avenues for generating profit in the 21st century economy. And it's driving this technology into every dark corner of our lives. I'll stop there. Happy to take thoughts or questions. Who wants to start us out?
David.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just wondering what other uplifting words you have for us today.
I started the conversation with what a beautiful sunshiny week I've had on the East Coast, and I was hoping that you guys were getting similar weather there. And we talked about the fact that you're getting vaccines and people have visitors there now. There's good news in the world. And look, I also started with the fact that for the first time in 50 years, our society seems to be getting serious about doing something about inequality and tackling the precariousness of people. But when it comes to analyzing technology, I don't want to suggest it's all bad. I mean, I'm actually a big fan of Wikipedia. And I myself did something fun for the first time in a long time the other day. I went to a museum wearing a mask and having taken a vaccine, right? But I went and saw the Goya exhibit in the Metropolitan Museum, and I was able to go online and get 3 lectures on Goya before I went to the exhibit, right? There's all kinds of good, fun, interesting stuff this technology does for us. The issue is, in its unregulated form, there's also a lot of stuff that I think we need to be aware of that is more problematic. And so that's what I'm trying to point out, David, is that we need to be alert to the downside of this technology.
I was just jesting.
I know you were pulling my leg, but I got to respond to the question I get. Wilma, go ahead.
Where does Zoom fit into all of this?
Zoom is not this model. Zoom you pay for, right? And to be clear, not if you've got the basic entry level model, but they're trying to get you hooked, right? And so my Zoom account, the one I'm speaking with you on today, costs me about $20 a month. And that's because I'm doing lectures like this. I'm actually, Piedmont Garden sets up this link. This is the Piedmont Garden Zoom link for you guys. But having said that, I do a lot of lecturing on my own account. My college also provides me with an account. I don't know how much Zoom is making from me, but my guess is it's probably several $100s a year. I pay them a couple $100 a year. And a lot of people, you may have seen, Zoom has become highly profitable by selling a subscription service. In that sense, it's an old business model with new technology. But Google is a new business model with new technology.
David?
Yep, go ahead, Ann.
The proliferation of technology into our lives and all of this, I think that the pandemic was, as with all of its other difficulties and what it's done to our lives, has enabled this, the spread of this kind of technology and its intrusion into our lives much faster than it might have otherwise happened.
Absolutely, Ann, and in a sense, that's the jumping off point for this whole lecture series, is these trends were there before COVID-19 upended our world. And in a sense, thank goodness they were there, because it's allowed us to continue having these meetings. It's allowed me to continue seeing my mom on a screen when I can't see her safely in person, right? It's allowed me to keep teaching my classes when it would be, perilous to be going into a classroom with 30 college students every day, right? And so there's a lot that this technology has allowed us to do during the pandemic that is something we should be deeply grateful for. But we should also notice that the pandemic is spreading this technology very quickly. And as I've said to you before, it may be, let us hope, that the pandemic will be brought under control in the next half a year, right? Joe Biden is now saying by the 4th of July. Wouldn't it be wonderful, right? And so if that is the case, will we just go back to where we were pre-pandemic? I certainly don't think so, right? And so I've already got colleagues saying, well, maybe we can hire this person to teach for us who lives in Europe or in California, because now we can do Zoom classes, right? We don't have to pay them to come to New York to teach for us. We can just have them teach on Zoom. And a year ago, that would have been a non-starter, right? No way. Right. We're a small liberal arts college. Everything has to be face-to-face. And having done now over a year of online education, It doesn't seem quite as frightening, quite as bad, quite as verboten as it was a year ago. So yes, we're going to feel the effects of this long after the pandemic has been brought under control. Did you have a follow-up, Ann?
I did. I agree with all of that, all the good that it's brought us, but I think that it also, because people, of course, have been online way more than they were before the pandemic, that's allowed the more insidious aspects of it to proliferate.
And please note that in 2018, the average American was spending over 6 hours a day on a screen, right? And so who knows what it is now? And my fiance at her workplace, she's a doctor. Her front desk person is a mother, a young single mother. Her son comes to work with her every day. So I've been observing a little bit what he does. And he has an iPad, and he goes to school on his iPad, right? He's a second, third grader, I think. And then as soon as school is done, he pushes a different app, and he's playing a video game with his friends on that same iPad. He's at work with his mom 8-9 hours a day. He's never off that computer, right? And to my mind, I just think, God, I would be so fried if I tried to spend that long on a computer. But he's doing it all the time now. Never.
That's his life. He doesn't know otherwise.
Yeah, and it's the necessity. His mom can't go to work unless she brings him, and there's no play space. It's an office complex, right? So he literally safely can't go outside to stretch his legs. I should bring a ball or a frisbee or something to work one of these days and get him out of doors. It's occurring to me that would be doing him a little service. I'd probably have fun too. I didn't hurt myself. Anybody else with a question or a thought today?
Are there any congressional initiatives aimed at regulating the surveillance economy?
Yeah, so interesting you asked that. And let me just point you really quickly back to Tim Wu. And Tim Wu's other more recent book, I'm sorry, it takes me a while to get there, The Curse of Bigness, right, which is Antitrust in the New Gilded Age. And this book was really about big tech and the way in which big tech is essentially as monopolistic as the corporate lords of the late 19th, early 20th century were, right? Google and Facebook just buy not only their competitors, but anybody who has a upstart startup that looks like it could be a competitor down the line, right? And so they just gobble up the whole domain. So Congress is looking more and more at anti-competitive practices in technology. And so in one sense, yes, but I think the deeper conversation we need to have not only about anti-competitive practices, but about the business model and whether or not the business model is one that involves sacrificing way too much of our data. And I'll get into this next week, but I just want to be clear about the way this works, right? You sign up to use Zoom. You click a box that says you accept the terms and conditions, right? Did you read those terms and conditions? You know, and as the people who write about this point out, you could get a really high-powered lawyer and pay them for a week's worth of work before they could read the terms and conditions. Because among the terms and conditions are things that allow other companies to surveil your data, not just Zoom, right? And then you'd have to go read the terms and conditions on those other companies, and it's just a rabbit hole or an incredibly complex web. And so I do think from a legal point of view, and there are people writing about this right now, that the whole idea of contractual consent, that when you click accept, you have meaningful opportunity to understand what you're consenting to before you actually sign that document, right? What we do online is we click. That it's just vacating that idea. And so that a central aspect of contract law is being violated. And that's part of the way that these companies get their permission to collect all this data. So we're not there yet, but I'm hoping that more and more attention will be called on it, and scholars like Shoshana Zuboff and Tim Wu, and then incidents like the spread of QAnon or the invasion of the Capitol encourage us to be more careful about our knowledge system in the 21st century. So we'll have to see if we develop the will, the expertise, and the courage to start thinking about how to regulate these companies. We're not there yet. All right, everybody. Wonderful being with you as always. Have really good weeks, and I'll look forward to seeing you next weekend. Take care. Bye-bye, guys.